In a recent philosophical inquiry titled The End of Theology, scholar Iman Motlagh Arani examines the epistemic boundaries of human reason. The article establishes a rigorous framework for understanding exactly where our capacity to conceptualize the divine completely stops. For centuries, classical theology operated under the assumption that the intellect could map the nature of God, but modern philosophy exposed the flaws in this project. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant demonstrated that when human reason attempts to grasp the unconditioned or the infinite, it collapses into contradiction. Martin Heidegger later argued that Western metaphysics had exhausted its resources by trying to reduce being itself to a mere object of study. In the context of Baha'i metaphysics, however, hitting this epistemological wall is not viewed as a crisis or a decline in religious authority. It is understood as a telos, a consummation. The inability of the mind to map the infinite is the point where theology actually achieves its ultimate purpose. Any object that lacks spatial position, exists outside of time, and cannot be quantified defies the very architecture of human cognition. Attempting to define an absolute reality using the categories of a contingent material world is structurally impossible. The Baha'i writings resolve this historical philosophical tension by abandoning speculative guesswork. Instead of trying to reason upward to define the undefinable, these texts provide a strict, revealed ontological structure that explicitly defines the limits of what can and cannot be known. Acknowledging the failure of speculative reason is not a defeat. Recognizing that we do not have the cognitive apparatus to grasp the infinite is a necessary prerequisite for true theological maturity. Contrast two approaches to the divine. Left, speculative conjecture, using logic to climb upward and define God's essence. This inevitably hits a hard epistemic barrier. Right, a revealed ontological structure, focusing on how the divine mediates itself downward into human experience. Adopting this structural model requires a pivot in method. The theologian must move away from the ambition of demonstrative abstraction, trying to prove the mechanics of the divine, and adopt a stance of epistemic humility. This is a principled acknowledgement of the boundaries of human cognition. It demands that we stop projecting created concepts onto an uncreated reality. By abandoning the futile attempt to define God's essence, theology is freed to fulfill its actual function, orienting human consciousness toward action, transformation, and spiritual becoming. At the top of this framework is the unknowable essence. God exists beyond all concept. Between this essence and the created world lies an impassable epistemic boundary. This limitation is structural. Just as a plant cannot comprehend human consciousness, the intellect cannot comprehend the infinite. Divine unknowability is not a temporary veil waiting to be lifted by human progress. No amount of future intellectual evolution and no subsequent spiritual revelation will ever pierce this specific boundary. The essence will always remain inaccessible. This absolute boundary serves a vital theological imperative. It protects the absolute from being reduced into a conceptual grasp, securing the radical otherness of God against the presumption of human speculation. But this creates an immediate philosophical tension. If the divine essence is totally inaccessible and devoid of all relation to created things, how does the cosmos exist? How does the necessary being interact with contingent reality? Acknowledging this uncrossable void requires the introduction of a precise architecture of mediation. There must be a bridge that translates the will of the necessary being into the reality of the contingent universe. This bridge is the first emanation, identified in Baha'i theology as the primal will, or al-Mashiach. It emerges just below the boundary of the absolute essence, serving as the first ontological act and the sole operative face of divinity. The primal will is the creative principle instantiating the universe. Yet we encounter a paradox. While it bridges the gap to creation, its true essence remains fundamentally unknowable. Human inquiry can receive its downward light, but can never penetrate its core reality. We can only know the primal will indirectly, mediated through its operations. We observe its acts of creation, its sustenance of existence, and the signs of its revelation, but we cannot apprehend it directly. This draws a sharp contrast with classical theology. When we speak of the attributes of God, mercy, justice, knowledge, we are actually describing the attributes of the primal will. The absolute essence is stripped of all such names and categories. By isolating these attributes to the first emanation, this structure secures God's absolute otherness. The essence remains untouched, while the primal will provides the necessary access for cosmic actualization and human orientation. In the physical and historical world, the primal will expresses itself through the manifestation of God, the Mazhar. This is the locus of divine self-disclosure, a theophanic presence embodying the will of God within the limitations of phenomenal reality. The manifestation is not God's essence inhabiting a body, but the divine will operating in history. Using the analogy of a mirror and the sun does not descend to occupy the mirror. The mirror simply reflects its light with pure transparency. Because of this, the manifestation is ontologically recurrent. It is one singular divine reality, shining into different historical mirrors across time, uniquely shaped to accommodate the specific capacity of humanity in that era. This creates an asymmetry of epistemic access. We cannot reach past the mirror. The manifestation is the exclusive locus through which divine reality discloses itself, marking the absolute limit of what humanity can comprehend. To seek knowledge of God beyond this point is to abandon reverence for reductionism. The manifestation embodies the articulation of the divine word, while simultaneously enforcing the strict boundary of human conceptual comprehension. Having mapped the descending mediation of the divine, we must turn our focus downward to the human response. The ontological center of human identity and the agent of this response is the soul. Just like the divine essence, the true nature of the human soul, its kun, is utterly concealed. It resists scientific quantification, evades philosophical capture, and operates outside the confines of physical causality. We can only observe the shapes it leaves in the material world. The soul is entirely non-spatial and immaterial. It does not exist inside the human body the way water sits inside a cup. It relates to the physical form the way light interacts with a mirror. Because its essence remains a structural mystery, we cannot analyze the soul directly. We can only map its reality by observing its orientation, its moral choices, and the effects it generates through consciousness and volition. The physical instruments of the body, the brain, the nervous system, the senses, do not generate the soul. They merely provide a mechanism to manifest the soul's latent capacities within a physical environment. Recognizing the structural unknowability of our own identity demands a shift in priorities. The goal is no longer to dissect and define the exact mechanics of the spirit, but to actively orient and purify it. If the soul is unknowable in its essence, and its physical mirror eventually breaks, what is the structure of its destiny beyond the material world? In this framework, physical death is not an extinction of consciousness, but a birth into a spiritual state. The soul retains individuality, severing biological reliance. Just as a fetus develops eyes in the womb, useless until birth, the soul uses the physical world to develop spiritual capacities. This afterlife is not a static destination or a final holding area of reward and punishment. It is an eternal progression. The soul engages in a ceaseless, non-spatial ascent toward the infinite perfection of the divine source. However, this ascent is entirely conditioned upon the soul's orientation. Stagnation is a real risk. To advance, the soul must actively turn toward the light, relying on the purification and detachment cultivated during its physical existence. And this brings us back to the end of theology. The realization that we cannot intellectually master the infinite is not a dead end. It is the precise moment when speculative hubris dies and lived orientation begins. Theology finds its ultimate fulfillment when it stops trying to solve God like a puzzle. When conceptual knowledge yields to epistemic reverence, abstract speculation transforms into a lived, eternal response to the divine light.